She's not breathing! Oh God, she's not breathing! The words came out of Claire Walker's mouth before she even realized she was screaming them. The dog lay limp in her arms, her ribs barely rising. The rain pounded against Claire's back, drenching her coat as she knelt on the cold pavement, cradling the animal's frail body. The storm had come out of nowhere, turning the quiet neighborhood into a blur of gray and pounding water. She had seen the dog only moments before, thin, muddy, and stumbling into the road like a shadow barely clinging to life. Cars had swerved, but one had come dangerously close, the wind from its passing sending the dog collapsing to the ground. Claire had reacted on instinct, running out without thinking, ignoring the sharp burn of rain against her skin. She had scooped the animal up, feeling nothing but bones and sodden fur beneath her hands. "Come on, stay with me," she whispered, pressing her fingers to the dog's side. A faint beat, a weak, slow thump against her palm. It was there, but just barely. A truck pulled up beside her, brakes screeching. "Ma'am, you need help?" A man's voice cut through the storm. He was out of the vehicle before she could even respond, a middle-aged guy in a flannel jacket and worn jeans. I need to get her to a vet, now!" Claire's voice shook, but she forced herself to stay focused. The man didn't hesitate. "Get in." She climbed into the truck with the dog still in her arms, careful not to jostle her fragile body. The interior was warm, smelling of coffee and sawdust, but Claire barely noticed. Her pulse thundered in her ears as the man swung the truck around and took off down the road, wipers struggling to clear the windshield. "There's an emergency clinic about 15 minutes from here," he said. "I'm Dale, by the way." "Claire," she managed, eyes fixed on the dog. "She's barely holding on." Dale nodded, his jaw tight as he pressed on the gas. "We'll get her there." The drive felt like forever. Claire kept her hands on the dog, feeling the weak rise and fall of her ribs, willing her to hold on just a little longer. The rain blurred the world outside, streetlights turning into streaks of yellow and red. Finally, Dale swung into a parking lot, pulling up right in front of a glass door with the words, "All Paws Emergency Veterinary Clinic," in bold white letters. Claire was out of the truck before the engine had fully stopped. The automatic doors slid open, and she rushed inside, the cold air hitting her like a slap. "I need help!" she called, stepping toward the front desk. A woman in blue scrubs looked up, eyes widening as she took in Claire's soaked appearance and the limp dog in her arms. "Dr. Lawson, we've got an emergency." A door swung open to the left, and a tall man in a white coat strode out. He took one look at the dog and motioned to a gurney being wheeled toward them by a vet tech. "Get her on here. Let's go." Claire placed the dog on the gurney, her hands shaking as the vet and tech whisked her through another set of doors. The last thing she saw before they disappeared was the dog's lifeless body and the determination on Dr. Lawson's face. The waiting room felt too quiet now. Claire stood there, dripping water onto the tiled floor, the storm still raging outside. Dale walked in behind her, shaking off his hat. "You okay?" She exhaled sharply. "I don't know." Dale nodded. "They'll do their best." Claire wanted to believe that, but the way the dog had felt in her arms, it didn't seem like there was much left keeping her here. She sank into one of the chairs, gripping her arms as she tried to stop the tremble in her hands. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The clinic had quieted down, the few other visitors coming and going, leaving only Claire and Dale waiting. Finally, the door to the back opened, and Dr. Lawson stepped out. Claire shot to her feet. "Is she—" "She's alive," he said. Relief flooded through her so fast she almost felt dizzy. Oh, thank God. But, the vet continued, his tone cautious, she's not out of the woods yet. Claire swallowed hard. What's wrong with her? Dr. Lawson sighed. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, and she's got a few fractures that are already in the process of healing, meaning whatever happened to her, it wasn't recent. Claire's stomach turned. Someone hurt her? Dr. Lawson nodded. It looks that way. She felt anger simmering beneath her relief. Who would do something like this? She's got a long recovery ahead of her, Dr. Lawson continued. But I'll be honest with you, she wouldn't have made it through the night if you hadn't found her. Claire's throat tightened. She hadn't done anything special. She had just been in the right place at the right time. But looking at the seriousness in the vet's expression, she realized that, to this dog, it had meant everything. She'll need care, Dr. Lawson said. A lot of it. But I think with time, she's got a chance. Claire didn't hesitate. I'll do whatever it takes. Dr. Lawson gave her a look, studying her carefully. That's good to hear. Because there's something else. Claire's stomach clenched. What? He glanced toward the back. Come with me. She followed him through the doors, Dale trailing behind. The clinic was quiet, the hum of machines and soft murmurs of staff the only sounds. Dr. Lawson led them into a room where the dog lay in a padded cage, an IV attached to her thin leg. She was awake now, her brown eyes barely open, but they flicked toward Claire as she stepped closer. Dr. Lawson crouched beside the cage, motioning for Claire to do the same. I didn't notice it right away, he said. But when we cleaned her up and checked for a microchip, we found something strange. Claire's heart pounded. What? Dr. Lawson reached for a tablet, pulling up a scan. She has a microchip, all right, but it was registered over 10 years ago. Claire blinked. What? Dr. Lawson nodded. And according to the records, this dog, he paused, glancing at the frail animal in the cage, was declared dead 6 years ago. Claire stared at Dr. Lawson, her breath catching in her throat. That's impossible. Dr. Lawson didn't look away from the tablet, his expression unreadable. I thought the same thing, but the chip number matches exactly. She turned her gaze back to the frail dog in the cage. Her brown eyes blinked slowly, exhaustion evident, but there was something else, something deep inside them, a familiarity that sent a chill up Claire's spine. Dale shifted beside her. Are you saying someone faked her death? Dr. Lawson sighed. That's one possibility. Another is that a mistake was made when the report was filed. But either way, this dog's past isn't as simple as it seems. Claire's heart pounded. Do we know who she belonged to? Dr. Lawson nodded and turned the tablet toward her. A name appeared at the top of the screen. Robert Sinclair. The name meant nothing to her, but it sent a shiver down her spine. Who is he? Dr. Lawson hesitated. A wealthy businessman. He made headlines a few years back when he reported his champion dog missing. The dog was presumed dead when no trace of her was found. Claire's fingers tightened into fists. Champion dog? Dr. Lawson nodded. According to the records, she was a prize-winning retriever. But if this is the same dog, she's a long way from the life she used to have. Claire's mind spun with possibilities. Do you think he's looking for her? Dr. Lawson rubbed his jaw. That's hard to say. After all these years, he might have moved on. Dale let out a low whistle. If this guy's rich, he might have had enemies. Maybe someone took the dog out of spite. Claire frowned. Then why let her suffer like this? Why dump her like trash? The thought made her stomach twist. She looked at the dog again, at her frail frame and the years of suffering evident in her body. Whoever had taken her, or whoever had abandoned her, hadn't cared about her well-being. Dr. Lawson placed a gentle hand on Claire's shoulder. She's safe now. That's what matters. Claire nodded, but her mind was already racing. This wasn't just about rescuing a lost dog anymore. This was something bigger, something she wasn't ready to walk away from. "Can I stay with her?" she asked softly. Dr. Lawson hesitated, then nodded. "I can't allow overnight visitors, but you can stay for a while." Claire crouched down and carefully reached through the bars, her fingers brushing against the dog's thin fur. The retriever let out a soft sigh, shifting slightly toward her touch. Claire swallowed hard. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. Hours passed in a blur. Claire stayed by the dog's side, speaking softly to her, watching her breathe. She barely registered when Dale left, promising to check in later. Dr. Lawson checked on them a few times, but otherwise she was left alone with the quiet hum of the clinic and the steady rise and fall of the dog's chest. At some point, the exhaustion caught up to her. She leaned against the side of the cage, her eyes growing heavy. She didn't mean to drift off, but the warmth of the clinic and the soft presence of the dog beside her lulled her into sleep. She woke to the sound of a door opening. Blinking, she sat up, her body stiff from the awkward position. Dr. Lawson stood nearby, his expression cautious. "We have a problem," he said. Claire's heart jumped. "What is it?" Dr. Lawson hesitated before speaking. "I called the number on the registration file. I needed to confirm whether the records were still active." Claire gripped the bars of the cage. "And?" Dr. Lawson exhaled. "Someone answered, and they want to meet her." Claire felt her stomach drop. "Who?" Dr. Lawson's expression turned unreadable. "Robert Sinclair." The name felt heavier this time, more real. Claire looked at the dog, still sleeping peacefully, unaware that the past she had escaped was now coming back for her. Her fingers brushed over the dog's fur. "When?" Dr. Lawson glanced at his watch. "Tomorrow morning." Claire swallowed hard. Everything was moving too fast. Just yesterday, this dog had been moments from death. Now she was about to meet the man who had once claimed her as his own. But what did he really want? That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She had gone home at Dr. Lawson's insistence, but her mind refused to quiet. She paced her small living room, her phone screen lighting up as she researched Robert Sinclair. The more she read, the more uneasy she felt. He was a well-respected businessman, but there were whispers of something darker. Allegations of cruelty toward his animals, claims that he had once been banned from breeding competitions for mistreatment. None of it had been proven, but it was enough to make Claire's stomach twist. What if returning this dog to him meant sending her back to a life of suffering? Her thoughts spun through the night, her heart heavy with uncertainty. By the time the sun rose, she had made a decision. She wasn't going to let him take the dog without a fight. Back at the clinic, she arrived early, stepping inside just as the morning staff was settling in. Dr. Lawson greeted her with a nod, but there was tension in his eyes. "He's on his way," he said. Claire nodded, steeling herself. She made her way to the recovery room, where the retriever lay curled in her cage. She looked better than she had the night before, still thin, still fragile, but there was a flicker of strength in her eyes when she lifted her head, Claire knelt beside her. "You ready for this?" The dog didn't respond, but Claire liked to believe she understood. Maybe she could feel the storm coming. Minutes later, the front door swung open. A tall man in a crisp suit stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking against the tile. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back, his sharp blue eyes scanning the clinic with the precision of someone used to being in control. Robert Sinclair. Claire watched from the hallway as he approached the front desk, his voice smooth but firm. Dr. Lawson met him with a professional nod, exchanging words Claire couldn't hear. Then Dr. Lawson gestured toward the recovery room. Claire braced herself as Robert Sinclair's gaze landed on her. He studied her for a moment before stepping forward, his expression unreadable. His eyes shifted to the dog in the cage. The moment stretched, thick with something Claire couldn't name. Then, finally, he spoke. "So, you found her." Claire's jaw tightened. "I did." Robert's lips pressed together as he observed the dog. "I never thought I'd see her again." Claire watched him closely, searching for any sign of emotion, but his face remained carefully neutral. Dr. Lawson cleared his throat. "She's been through a lot. If you're here to take her back, I need to ask a few questions first." Robert lifted a brow. "Questions?" Claire crossed her arms. "Yes. Because if you think I'm just going to hand her over without knowing what kind of life she's going back to, you're mistaken." Robert turned his gaze on her, his blue eyes sharp. "And who exactly are you?" Claire met his stare head-on. "Someone who cares." The tension in the room thickened. The dog stirred, shifting slightly in her cage. Robert's gaze flicked to her, something unreadable passing through his eyes. Then he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "There's something you should know." Claire didn't move. The weight of Robert Sinclair's words settled over her like a storm cloud. "There's something you should know," he had said, his voice measured, careful. It sent a chill through her, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she met his gaze with steady defiance, her fingers gripping the bars of the cage where the dog lay resting. "What is it?" she asked, forcing her voice to stay even. Robert exhaled slowly, his eyes flicking from Claire to the retriever. "I never wanted to report her dead." Claire frowned. "What?" He slid his hands into his pockets. "It wasn't my decision." Dr. Lawson, who had been standing silently nearby, crossed his arms. "Then whose decision was it?" Robert's jaw tightened. "My wife's." Claire blinked. "Your wife?" Robert nodded, his gaze distant. "At the time, we were going through difficulties. I traveled a lot, and she was the one who managed the dogs when I wasn't home. I trusted her to take care of them." Claire could sense there was more. "And?" Robert hesitated, then sighed. "One day, I came back from a business trip, and she told me our retriever had run away. She said she searched, hired people to look, but there was no trace of her. A few months later, she insisted we report her as dead so we could move on. I didn't like it, but I eventually agreed. What choice did I have?" Claire studied him carefully. "You're saying she lied?" Robert's eyes darkened. "I think she did more than lie. I think she got rid of her." A silence stretched between them. Claire looked at the dog, at her frail body, the suffering she had endured. If what Robert was saying was true, his wife had done something unforgivable. Dr. Lawson spoke up. "Why would she do that?" Robert shook his head. "That's what I don't know. Maybe she didn't like the responsibility. Maybe she didn't want a dog at all. I traveled so much that I never questioned what she did when I wasn't around. Claire's stomach twisted. So you think she dumped her? Robert let out a slow breath. That's what I'm starting to believe. Claire's mind raced. This explained why the dog had been found in such a terrible state. She had been abandoned, left to survive on her own, while the people who were supposed to love her moved on without a second thought. Dale, who had remained quiet up until now, finally spoke. So what now? Robert glanced at him before shifting his focus back to Claire. I want to take her home. Claire stiffened. Home? Robert nodded. I failed her once. I won't do it again. The conviction in his voice gave Claire pause. He sounded sincere, but sincerity wasn't enough to erase what had happened. She glanced at Dr. Lawson, who was watching Robert carefully. Legally, she's still registered under your name, Dr. Lawson said. You have the right to claim her. But if Claire's concerns are valid, I can't in good conscience let her go without knowing she's going somewhere safe. Robert met Claire's gaze. I understand. Claire took a deep breath. I need more than just words. How do I know you're going to take care of her? That she won't end up suffering again? Robert's expression softened. You don't. But I want to prove it to you. Claire hesitated. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that this man regretted what had happened and wanted to make it right. But trust wasn't something that came easily, especially not when the stakes were this high. I need time to think, she said finally. Robert nodded. I understand, but please don't take too long. I want to be the one who helps her heal. Claire looked at the dog again. She wished she could ask her what she wanted, wished she could know if Robert truly meant what he said. But all she had to go on was instinct. And right now, instinct told her this wasn't over yet. The next morning, Claire woke with a sense of unease twisting in her stomach. She had barely slept, turning over Robert's words in her mind again and again. She wanted to believe he had good intentions, but a nagging voice in her head told her to be cautious. As she arrived at the clinic, she found Dr. Lawson already waiting for her. He nodded in greeting, handing her a coffee. Rough night? Claire took a sip, sighing. You could say that. I did some digging last night, Dr. Lawson said, leaning against the counter. Robert Sinclair's wife, ex-wife now, filed for divorce 2 years after the dog went missing. There were some legal disputes, but nothing that caught my eye until I found a deposition she gave in court. Claire frowned. What did she say? Dr. Lawson hesitated. She admitted to getting rid of the dog, but she never said where or how, just that it was taken care of. Claire's grip tightened on the coffee cup. That sounds ominous. Dr. Lawson nodded. It does. But here's the thing. She also said Robert knew. Claire's breath caught. Knew what? Knew she had done something to get rid of the dog. Claire's mind raced. Had Robert really been in the dark all this time? Or was this just another well-crafted lie? Dr. Lawson exhaled. Look, I know this is a lot, but I think before we let him take her, we need more than just words. Claire nodded. I agree. I'm not giving her up until I know she'll be safe. Just then the front door opened. Robert Sinclair stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking against the tile. He looked more tired than he had the day before, his shoulders tense as he approached them. Good morning, he said, his voice carefully polite. Have you made a decision? Claire exchanged a glance with Dr. Lawson before turning back to him. Not yet, but we have some questions. Robert studied her, then nodded. Ask whatever you need. Claire took a deep breath. Did you know? About your wife getting rid of her? Robert's expression shifted slightly, but he didn't look away. I suspected, but I never had proof. Claire narrowed her eyes. That's not good enough. Did you ever try to find out what she did? Robert hesitated. I should have. I regret that I didn't, but by the time I realized something was off, the damage had already been done. Claire crossed her arms. And now you just expect us to hand her over? Robert shook his head. No. I expect you to do what's best for her, and I hope that includes letting her come home with me. The tension in the room was thick. The dog stirred slightly in her cage, as if sensing the weight of the conversation happening around her. Claire met Robert's gaze. Then prove it. Robert's brows furrowed. How? Claire's voice was steady. Show me you're willing to do whatever it takes, because right now, I'm not convinced. Robert's gaze flickered between Claire and Dr. Lawson, his expression unreadable. He let out a slow breath, and then, for the first time, he looked at the dog with something other than possession in his eyes. Something deeper. Something resembling regret. What do you need me to do? He asked finally. Claire had expected resistance, maybe even anger. But the fact that he was asking this, that he was open to proving himself, made her pause. She glanced at Dr. Lawson, who gave her a barely perceptible nod. We need to see consistency, she said. It's easy to show up for one day, but this dog has been through enough. She needs stability, patience, and trust. If you want to take her back, you need to prove that you're capable of providing those things. Robert straightened slightly, adjusting his sleeves as if the weight of the moment was settling into his bones. How do I do that? Dr. Lawson folded his arms. For starters, we need to see you here every day. Not just once, not just for an hour, but regularly. We need to see that you're willing to put in the time. Robert hesitated for a split second before nodding. Fine. I can do that. Claire wasn't finished. We also need to know what kind of life you're taking her back to. I need to see your home, where she'll be staying. If it's not a good environment, I won't let her go with you. Robert's jaw tightened at that, but he gave a sharp nod. Understood. Claire searched his face, looking for any sign of hesitation, any sign that he would waver. But for the first time, she saw something that almost looked like determination. She wasn't sure if it was genuine or if he was simply going through the motions to get what he wanted. But either way, she wasn't about to back down. Then let's start now, she said. Robert looked between them, then at the dog. His expression softened, and for a brief moment Claire thought she saw something genuine there. He took a step closer to the cage, crouching down so he was at eye level with the retriever. Hey there, he murmured. I'm sorry. I should have fought harder for you. The dog lifted her head slightly, her brown eyes meeting his. There was no recognition, no instant spark of familiarity. But there was something else. A quiet curiosity, a tentative trust that hadn't been there before. Claire watched closely, every muscle in her body tense. This was the moment that mattered. Not the words, not the promises, but this. The way he approached her, the way he let her react in her own time. The dog sniffed the air, her nose twitching. Slowly, cautiously, she shifted just an inch closer. It wasn't much, but it was something. Robert didn't push. He didn't try to force affection. He just stayed there, watching her, waiting. Claire exhaled, releasing a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. You've got a long way to go, she told him. But this is a start. For the next week, Robert returned to the clinic every single day. He came early in the morning, often before Claire even arrived, and sat with the retriever for hours. He didn't try to push anything. He simply sat with her, talking to her in a quiet voice, offering her food, waiting for her to come to him on her own terms. At first, the dog remained wary. She kept her distance, watching him cautiously, but never fully approaching. But by the third day, something shifted. When Robert entered the room, she lifted her head. By the fourth day, she sniffed his outstretched hand. By the sixth, she took a treat from his palm. Claire watched it all unfold with a mix of apprehension and reluctant hope. She still wasn't sure if she trusted Robert completely, but she couldn't deny that he was putting in the effort. On the seventh day, Dr. Lawson approached her. "We should check out his home," he said. "If he's serious, we need to see where she'll be living." Claire nodded. "I was thinking the same thing." Later that afternoon, Robert led them to his house. It wasn't what Claire had expected. She had envisioned something cold and sterile, but instead she found herself standing in front of a quiet, well-maintained property with a large backyard and a secure fence. Robert unlocked the door and stepped inside, motioning for them to follow. "Come in. See for yourselves." Claire hesitated before stepping inside. The house was spacious but warm, filled with framed photos and signs of a lived-in space. A dog bed sat by the fireplace, looking well used despite the absence of a dog. "I never got rid of her things," Robert admitted, catching Claire's gaze. "I always hoped she'd come back." Something in Claire's chest tightened, but she forced herself to remain objective. "It's a good space," she admitted. "But it's not just about where she'll be living. It's about how you'll care for her." Robert met her gaze. "Then let me keep proving it." Claire studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Okay, but I'm not making any final decisions yet." Robert exhaled, a mixture of relief and determination flashing in his eyes. "Fair enough." Over the next few weeks, Robert continued to show up. He followed every instruction Dr. Lawson gave him. He took notes, asked questions, and adjusted when needed. Slowly but surely, the dog started to trust him. The first time she let him scratch behind her ears, Claire knew something had changed. The first time she leaned against him, she knew a decision would have to be made soon. But Claire wasn't ready to say goodbye. Not yet. Because somewhere along the way, this dog had stopped being just another rescue case. She had become something more. And Claire wasn't sure she was ready to let go. Claire found herself watching Robert more closely than ever. Every interaction he had with the dog, every movement he made, she analyzed with a critical eye. She had seen people change their behavior when they wanted something. She had seen people put on an act. And as much as she wanted to believe he was sincere, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something still wasn't right. Each day that passed, the retriever grew more comfortable with him. She took food from his hand without hesitation, allowed him to pet her, even let him slip a leash onto her without flinching. It was slow progress, but it was progress nonetheless. Claire knew that if this continued, she would eventually have to make a decision. Dr. Lawson had remained quiet on the matter, waiting for Claire to reach her own conclusion. But she could see it in his eyes. He was starting to believe Robert might actually deserve a second chance. On the 12th day, Robert arrived earlier than usual. Claire was already at the clinic, going over reports, when she saw him through the glass doors. He looked different this morning, less guarded, more at ease. He stepped inside and greeted her with a nod. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied, closing the file she was working on. "You're here early." "I thought I'd take her outside for a bit before it gets too hot," he said, glancing toward the back where the dog was resting. Claire hesitated, then nodded. "That's fine, but I'm coming with you." Robert didn't argue. He simply nodded and followed her to the back, where the retriever lay curled up in her bed. Her ears perked up when she saw him, and Claire couldn't deny the flicker of something warm in her chest at the sight of it. Robert crouched down beside the dog and ran a gentle hand along her back. "Hey there," he murmured. "Ready for some fresh air?" The retriever lifted her head and licked her lips before stretching out her legs. She still moved slowly, her body weak from the months, maybe years of neglect she had endured. But the improvement was undeniable. Claire grabbed the leash from the nearby counter and handed it to Robert. "Let's see how she does today." Together, they walked outside into the clinic's small, fenced-in yard. The grass was soft beneath their feet, still cool from the morning shade. The retriever stepped hesitantly onto the grass, sniffing the air. Robert held the leash loosely, giving her space. "Take your time," he said quietly. The dog did just that. She wandered a few steps forward, then back, then forward again, her tail giving the slightest wag. Claire folded her arms across her chest and watched. "She's getting stronger," Robert observed. Claire nodded. "She is." Silence stretched between them, the kind that felt full of things left unsaid. Claire shifted on her feet before finally speaking. "If I let you take her home, what happens next?" Robert exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "She'll have everything she needs: proper food, medical care, a safe place to sleep. I have a trainer who works with rescues. He can help her regain confidence, work through whatever fears she still has." Claire wasn't convinced yet. "And what about you?" Robert's brow furrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what happens if things get hard? If she doesn't adjust right away? If she has setbacks? Are you willing to deal with that?" Robert looked at the retriever, who was now sniffing the ground a few feet away, before turning his gaze back to Claire. "Yes," he said firmly. "I know I can't undo the past, but I want to do right by her now. And that means being patient, sticking through the rough patches. I'm not walking away this time." Claire studied him for a long moment, searching for any hint of doubt in his expression. But there was none. He meant it. She let out a slow breath. "I'm going to do a home visit tomorrow," she finally said. "I want to see her space again, and I want to see how she reacts to it before I make my final decision." Robert nodded without hesitation. "That's fair." Claire glanced at the dog, who was now watching them with quiet curiosity. "If she doesn't want to go with you, I won't force her." Robert's lips pressed into a thin line, but he nodded. "I wouldn't want you to." The next day, Claire arrived at Robert's house with the retriever sitting beside her in the passenger seat. The dog had started to trust car rides again, though she was still hesitant when the engine first rumbled to life. Claire reached over and gave her a reassuring scratch behind the ears. "Almost there," she murmured. Robert was already outside when they pulled up. He had left the gate open for them, standing at the entrance with his hands in his pockets. When Claire stepped out of the car, he gave her a small nod. "You ready?" he asked. Claire opened the door, but she didn't answer him. Instead, she watched the retriever closely. The dog sniffed the air, her ears twitching as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Then, slowly, she stepped out of the car. Robert didn't move. He just let her explore. The retriever took cautious steps forward, glancing back at Claire once before continuing. She made her way toward the house, pausing at the entrance before stepping inside. Claire followed close behind, watching every movement, every reaction. The house was just as it had been the last time. Clean, warm, inviting. The dog moved carefully through the space, her nails clicking against the hardwood floor. Then she stopped. Claire followed her gaze and felt her chest tighten. In the corner of the living room, against the fireplace, sat an old dog bed. It was worn, the fabric slightly frayed at the edges, but it was unmistakable. The retriever stepped toward it, sniffing hesitantly. Then, to Claire's surprise, she let out a soft sigh and curled up inside it. Robert exhaled beside her. She remembers. Claire swallowed against the lump in her throat. Maybe. They stood in silence, watching the dog settle in. For the first time since she had found her, the retriever didn't look uneasy or unsure. She just looked home. Claire turned to Robert. I still want updates. Regular ones. And if anything seems off, if she shows signs of distress, I want to know immediately. Robert nodded. Of course. She took a deep breath, then crouched down and rubbed the retriever's head. You okay, girl? She whispered. The dog didn't answer, but she pressed her nose against Claire's hand before resting her head down again. Claire smiled, just slightly. All right, she said. She's yours. Robert's expression softened, and for the first time, Claire saw something that looked like real gratitude in his eyes. Thank you. She nodded, standing up. Just take care of her. I will. As Claire turned to leave, she hesitated at the door, glancing back one last time. The retriever was still curled up in the bed, breathing slow and even. Maybe, just maybe, she had made the right choice after all. Claire drove home that evening with her thoughts tangled in a storm of emotions. The retriever was gone, in Robert's care now, and even though she had made the decision with careful deliberation, something inside her felt unsettled. Maybe it was just the weight of responsibility finally lifting, or maybe it was something more. Something she couldn't quite put into words. The clinic felt emptier the next day. She had grown used to seeing the retriever in the back room, had grown accustomed to the slow wag of her tail and the quiet way she watched everything unfold around her. Now, without her there, Claire realized just how much space the dog had occupied in her life. Dr. Lawson noticed the shift in her mood almost immediately. You all right? He asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee as she sat at her desk, staring at the medical records she was supposed to be updating. She hesitated before nodding. Yeah, just adjusting. He gave her a knowing look. It's not easy, letting go. Claire let out a soft chuckle. She's not gone forever. I'll be checking in. And if things go south? Claire glanced at him, her jaw tightening. Then I'll be there. Dr. Lawson nodded approvingly. Good. The first few days without the retriever were quiet. Claire checked in with Robert regularly, making sure the dog was adjusting. He sent updates, sometimes pictures, sometimes short messages about how she was settling in. He kept up with everything Claire had asked. Regular feeding, slow introductions to his home, daily walks that didn't push her too hard. And still, something gnawed at Claire. On the 5th day, Robert called her. It wasn't the usual text update or a short check-in. It was a direct phone call, and the moment Claire answered, she could hear something in his voice, something urgent. She won't eat, he said without preamble. She was fine yesterday, but today she won't touch her food. She just stares at it. Claire's stomach clenched. Has anything changed? Anything that might have spooked her? I don't think so, Robert said. I took her out for her morning walk like usual. She seemed fine, but when we got back, she just curled up in her bed and wouldn't move much. Claire stood up, already reaching for her car keys. "I'm coming over." 20 minutes later, she pulled into Robert's driveway. He was waiting for her at the front door, his face lined with concern. He stepped aside to let her in, and the moment she saw the retriever, her chest tightened. The dog was curled up in her bed by the fireplace, just like she had been when Claire left. But something was different. Her eyes lacked their usual alertness, her body tense in a way that told Claire something was wrong. Claire knelt beside her, running a gentle hand along her back. "Hey, girl." The retriever flicked her tail once, but it was weak. Claire's worry deepened. When was the last time she drank water? "She took a few sips this morning, but not much," Robert admitted. Claire pressed her lips together. Dehydration could become dangerous quickly. "She might need fluids. I need to take her back to the clinic." Robert didn't hesitate. "I'll grab my keys." At the clinic, Dr. Lawson was already waiting. He set up an IV drip as Claire stayed by the retriever's side, whispering softly to her. The dog's breathing was steady, but her energy remained low. Dr. Lawson ran a few quick tests, frowning as he read the results. "Her vitals aren't dangerously low, but something's definitely off. Could be stress-related." Claire sighed. Change can be hard on rescues. Even with the best environment, sometimes it takes time. Robert stood nearby, his expression tight. "What can I do?" "For now, we get her stable," Dr. Lawson said. "We'll keep her overnight, make sure she's hydrated and monitor her vitals. If nothing else is physically wrong, then we'll have to consider the possibility that this is emotional." Claire exchanged a glance with Robert. She knew he had done everything right, but trauma didn't heal overnight. That night, Claire stayed late at the clinic. She sat with the retriever as she rested, her fingers gently scratching behind her ears. "You scared us today," she murmured. "But we're not giving up on you." The retriever let out a soft breath and, for the first time in hours, pressed her nose against Claire's palm. The next morning, her appetite returned. She drank water, nibbled on her food, and by noon, she was showing signs of energy again. Robert arrived to pick her up, relief evident in his eyes as he watched her stand up and stretch. "Is she okay?" Dr. Lawson nodded. "Physically, yes, but she needs stability. She needs to know she's safe." Robert crouched beside her, running a hand along her back. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. Claire watched him carefully, searching for any sign of doubt. But he looked steady, grounded. He meant what he said. She exhaled. "Then let's take her home." The next few weeks weren't perfect. There were still moments of hesitation, still nights where the retriever curled up tighter than she should, still days where she moved with a wariness that spoke of old wounds. But Robert never faltered. He showed up day after day, proving that he was willing to do the work. Claire visited often. At first, to check on the dog. But soon, she realized she was checking on something else, too. She was checking on Robert. She wasn't sure when her wariness toward him began to fade, but it did. Slowly, steadily, just like the retriever's trust. She still held on to the past, still kept a careful distance, but something inside her had shifted. One evening, as she stood on Robert's porch, watching the retriever trot around the yard with a little more confidence, he spoke. "I don't think I ever said thank you." Claire glanced at him. For what? For not giving up on her. For making sure she had the right chance. Claire shrugged, but there was warmth in her chest. "That's my job." Robert shook his head. "It's more than that." Claire didn't respond, But as she looked back at the retriever, stronger than before, steadier than before, she realized he was right. It was more than that. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, but Claire still found herself unable to fully let go of her caution. The retriever had made undeniable progress, slowly regaining her energy, but Claire wasn't convinced that the road ahead would be easy. Every rescue dog carried a past, and that past had a way of resurfacing when least expected. Robert remained steadfast. He followed every instruction given to him, checked in regularly, and continued to be patient with the dog's progress. Claire had seen adopters falter before, grow impatient when progress wasn't immediate, or when the process became frustrating. But Robert hadn't shown any signs of backing down. Still, Claire found herself lingering at the clinic every time he called with an update, waiting for the moment something might go wrong. One evening, just as she was locking up the clinic, her phone rang. Robert's name flashed across the screen. She answered immediately. "She's acting strange," he said without preamble. "She was fine earlier, but now she keeps pacing near the door like she's waiting for something. She won't settle." Claire frowned. "Is there anything outside? A noise that could be making her nervous?" "I checked," Robert said. "Nothing out of the ordinary. I even tried distracting her with a treat, but she won't take it." Claire's grip on her phone tightened. This wasn't just a one-off behavior. This was anxiety resurfacing. "I'm coming over," she said. "Just try to keep her calm." When she arrived, Robert was standing in the doorway, watching the retriever, who was still pacing anxiously near the front door. The moment Claire stepped inside, the dog's head snapped toward her, and for the first time in hours, she hesitated. Claire knelt down, keeping her voice low. "Hey, girl, what's going on?" The retriever's tail wagged hesitantly, but she remained where she was, her ears still flicking toward the door. "She's waiting for something," Claire murmured. "Or someone." Robert ran a hand through his hair. "But who? It's just been me and her here. No visitors." Claire exhaled slowly. Sometimes they get stuck in old routines. She might be remembering something from her past. Robert's face darkened. "Something from before?" Claire nodded. "It's possible." They waited, neither speaking as the retriever continued pacing in a slow, deliberate motion. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the dog let out a small, distressed whine before turning in a slow circle and finally lying down near the door. Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She's expecting something that isn't coming. Robert knelt down beside her. "How do we help her?" Claire hesitated. "It's going to take time. She has to learn that she's safe here, that no one's coming to take her away again." Robert was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Then we keep doing what we've been doing." Claire watched him carefully. She had doubted him at the start, unsure if he had what it took to follow through, but now she realized that she had been wrong. Robert wasn't just going through the motions, he cared. "She'll get there," she said, finally standing. "It won't be overnight, but she'll get there." Robert exhaled. "Yeah, I just wish I knew what she was waiting for." Claire glanced at the retriever, who had finally laid her head down, her eyes still fixed on the door. "Me too." That night, Claire barely slept. Her mind kept returning to the retriever's behavior, the way she had waited by the door as if expecting someone to walk through it. Was it a past owner? A routine she had once followed? There was no way to know for sure. The next day, Robert called again. "She slept better last night, but she was up early, waiting at the door again." Claire sighed. It might be a pattern she follows for a while. Try distracting her with a walk before she starts pacing. Get her focused on something else. Robert agreed. and for a few days that strategy seemed to help. The pacing wasn't completely gone, but it was less frequent. The retriever started settling more, allowing herself to enjoy her new surroundings, instead of anxiously waiting for something that wasn't coming. Then, a week later, something changed. Claire was at the clinic when her phone buzzed with a text from Robert. "Something's wrong. She won't stop barking at the window. Won't calm down." Claire didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way." When she arrived, the retriever was standing by the window, her entire body stiff, ears pinned forward. She was barking, not out of fear, but with intent. Claire had seen dogs behave like this before. This wasn't random. She was responding to something outside. Robert stood beside her, his hands clenched at his sides. "I don't see anything, but she won't stop." Claire moved toward the window, peering out. At first, she saw nothing but the street and the houses across from Robert's. But then she noticed it. A figure standing near the edge of the sidewalk. Claire's stomach twisted. "Did you see them before?" Robert shook his head. Not until she started barking. The person wasn't moving, just standing there, almost as if watching the house. Claire couldn't make out their face from the distance, but something about it sent unease crawling up her spine. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing down the street. The retriever stopped barking, but she remained by the window, watching the spot where the figure had been. Claire turned to Robert. "Have you seen anyone hanging around lately?" He shook his head, his expression tight. "No, but I don't like this." Claire nodded, her mind racing. The retriever's past had always been a mystery, and now, for the first time, it felt like that past wasn't just lingering in her memories, it was standing outside Robert's house, watching. "We need to figure out who that was," she said, her voice steady. "And why she reacted like that." Robert nodded. "Yeah, and we need to make sure she's safe." Claire looked at the retriever, who had finally settled, but whose eyes remained locked on the window. Something told her this wasn't over yet. Claire sat in her car outside Robert's house, long after the figure had disappeared. The retriever had finally settled, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She wasn't just worried about the dog anymore. Something about that person standing outside made her uneasy. It wasn't random. She pulled out her phone and dialed Dr. Lawson. He answered on the second ring. "Claire, everything okay?" "Not really," she admitted. The retriever had another episode today, but this time it wasn't just anxiety. There was someone outside Robert's house, just standing there, watching. She started barking like she recognized them. Dr. Lawson was silent for a moment. "Did you get a good look?" "No. They left before we could see their face." "That's not good," he said. "It could be nothing, but it could also be someone from her past. If she recognized them, it means they played some role in what happened to her." Claire gripped the steering wheel. "I can't just sit on this. What if they come back?" Dr. Lawson sighed. "Maybe it's time to do some digging. We still don't know how she ended up on the street. If Robert's ex-wife got rid of her, she didn't just set her loose. Someone else was involved. Maybe this person knows something." Claire glanced at the house. Robert had stayed inside after she left, sitting with the retriever until she calmed down. She could tell he was shaken too. "I'll look into it," she said, "but I need to make sure she's safe first." The next morning, Claire showed up at Robert's house earlier than usual. When he opened the door, she could tell he hadn't slept much. "She had trouble settling again," he said. "She kept going back to the window." Claire stepped inside, her eyes immediately going to the retriever. She was lying near the fireplace, but her ears perked up when Claire entered. Claire knelt beside her, running a hand over her back. "Hey, girl." The retriever lifted her head. then glanced toward the window. Claire exchanged a look with Robert. She's still waiting. Robert exhaled. I don't like this. Claire stood up. I want to check something. You said you never saw that person before, right? Robert shook his head. Never. She nodded. Then let's see if anyone else has. They spent the next few hours visiting neighbors, asking if anyone had seen someone suspicious near Robert's house. Most people had noticed nothing, but one older woman 2 doors down frowned when Claire described the figure. There was someone, she said. Didn't look like they belonged here. I saw them yesterday too, walking past the house slow, looking around. Claire's pulse quickened. Did you see their face? The woman shook her head. They kept their hood up, but something about them didn't sit right with me. Claire thanked her and walked back to Robert, who was standing a few feet away, his arms crossed. That's twice now, he said. They were here before today. Claire nodded. We need to figure out who they are. Back at the clinic, Claire pulled up old reports, searching for anything connected to the retriever's past. Dr. Lawson helped, scanning through vet records, trying to find any missing links. Then, finally, something. There's a name, Dr. Lawson said, pointing at the screen. Lisa Halloway. She used to work for Robert's ex-wife. Claire's stomach clenched. Do we have anything on her? Dr. Lawson scrolled. No current address. She left town a few years ago, but before that, she handled the dogs in the household. If the retriever remembers someone, it might be her. Claire tapped her fingers against the desk. If she's back, that means she has a reason. Dr. Lawson nodded. And it might not be a good one. That evening, Claire sat in her car outside Robert's house again. She wasn't going to let the retriever, or Robert, be left in the dark. She stayed for hours, watching, waiting, but no one showed up. The next morning, Robert called. She had another episode. This time it was worse. Claire drove over as fast as she could. When she walked inside, she immediately noticed the retriever trembling near the fireplace. She started barking at nothing, Robert said. Pacing again. I tried to calm her down, but nothing worked. Claire crouched beside the dog. It's okay, girl. The retriever flinched, but leaned into Claire's touch. Robert ran a hand down his face. What do we do? Claire looked at him. We find Lisa Halloway. She spent the next day digging through public records, searching for any trace of Lisa. She called former employees of Robert's ex-wife, anyone who might know where she had gone. Then, finally, a lead. A shelter 2 towns over had a volunteer listed under the name Lisa Halloway. Claire wasted no time. She drove out that afternoon, pulling up to a modest building with a row of kennels visible through the fence. Inside, she asked for Lisa. A woman with tired eyes and dark hair tied back in a bun stepped out of the office. When she saw Claire, she froze. Lisa Halloway? Claire asked. Lisa hesitated. Who's asking? Claire pulled out her phone, showing a picture of the retriever. This dog remembers you. Lisa's face paled. She looked at the picture for a long time before whispering, She's alive? Claire's heart pounded. You thought she wasn't? Lisa swallowed hard. I need to tell you something. Claire folded her arms. Then start talking. Lisa glanced around before sighing. I never wanted to get rid of her. I tried to stop it. Claire's stomach twisted. Stop what? Lisa exhaled. Robert's ex-wife didn't just want her gone. She wanted her. She hesitated, then whispered, Put down. Claire's blood went cold. What? Lisa nodded. I couldn't do it. I took her and let her go instead. I thought she'd have a better chance that way. Claire clenched her fists. That's why she remembers you. She trusted you. Lisa's eyes were filled with guilt. I never knew what happened to her after that. Claire took a deep breath. She survived. And now someone's been watching Robert's house. Lisa's face darkened. Then she's not safe. Claire nodded. No, she's not. And we need to find out why. Claire sat across from Lisa in the dimly lit break room of the shelter. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, and the distant barks of dogs echoed through the corridors. Lisa's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the paper coffee cup in front of her, her knuckles white. Tell me everything, Claire said, keeping her voice steady. Start from the beginning. Lisa let out a long breath. I worked for Robert's ex-wife, as you know. My job was to take care of the dogs, make sure they were trained, well-fed. But things changed after the divorce. She wasn't happy, and she wasn't the kind of person to let go of things easily. Claire listened closely, her mind racing. One day, she told me she wanted the retriever gone, Lisa continued. Said it was a reminder of a mistake she never should have made. I thought she meant rehoming, so I suggested reaching out to a rescue. But she made it clear she didn't mean rehoming. Claire's stomach twisted. She wanted her put down. Lisa nodded. I couldn't do it. I told her I would, but instead I drove the retriever as far as I could, hoping she'd find a kind stranger or someone who'd help her. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I should have done more. Claire exhaled, trying to steady her own emotions. You saved her life. That means something. Lisa shook her head. I should have done more to protect her. And now, if someone's watching Robert's house, that means his ex-wife might not be finished. Claire's heart pounded. She doesn't even know the retriever is still alive, does she? Lisa hesitated. Maybe she does now. If she found out the microchip was scanned at the clinic, if she knows you're involved, she might have put the pieces together. Claire's mind whirred. That shadowy figure outside Robert's house. It hadn't just been coincidence. Whoever it was, they were looking for the dog. Do you know where she is now? Claire asked. Robert's ex-wife? Lisa pressed her lips together. Last I heard, she moved out of state. But money isn't an issue for her. If she wanted to keep tabs on something, she could. And if she's back, she's here for a reason. Claire stood abruptly, pacing. We need to warn Robert. If she thinks the retriever is back in his life, she might try to take her again. Lisa nodded. And if she was willing to get rid of her once, she won't hesitate to do it again. Claire didn't waste another second. She grabbed her phone and dialed Robert. He picked up almost immediately. Claire? We have a problem, she said, heading for the door. Where are you? Home? What's going on? Lock your doors. Keep the retriever inside. I'll explain when I get there. Robert didn't argue. I'll be waiting. Claire turned back to Lisa. If you want to help make this right, come with me. Lisa nodded and grabbed her coat. Let's go. By the time they reached Robert's house, the air was thick with tension. Claire stepped out of the car first, scanning the street for any signs of movement. The night was eerily quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows. Robert opened the door before she could knock. His expression was tense. Tell me what's going on. Lisa hesitated behind Claire, but Claire didn't waste time. We think your ex-wife knows the retriever is alive. And if that's the case, she might try to take her. Robert's jaw clenched. How? She hasn't been in my life for years. That doesn't mean she isn't watching, Claire said. Someone's been outside your house. Lisa recognized the pattern. Your ex-wife ordered the retriever's removal once, and if she knows she's still alive, she could be trying again. Robert turned toward the retriever, who was lying on her bed near the fireplace. She looked up, her brown eyes watching them all carefully, as if sensing the unease in the room. "She's not taking her," Robert said firmly. "I won't let her." "Then we need a plan," Claire said. "We don't know if she'll come herself or send someone else, but we have to be ready." Lisa swallowed hard. "I'll help however I can." Robert nodded. "First, we need security cameras. If she or anyone else comes near, I want to know about it." "I can help set those up," Claire said. "And in the meantime, we need to keep the retriever somewhere safe. A place she wouldn't think to look." Robert frowned. "Where would that be?" Claire hesitated, then realized the answer. "My place." Robert's eyes met hers. "You'd take her?" Claire nodded. "She trusts me. And it's only temporary, just until we know what we're dealing with." Robert exhaled, then looked at the retriever. "Would you be okay with that, girl?" The retriever wagged her tail slightly, then looked at Claire, her body relaxing just a bit. Robert nodded. "All right. We move her tonight." A few hours later, Claire pulled into her driveway, the retriever curled up in the passenger seat beside her. She had been quiet during the ride, but her head rested against Claire's leg, seeking comfort. Claire reached down and scratched behind her ears. "We're gonna keep you safe, okay?" The retriever let out a soft sigh, as if she understood. Claire opened the door and led her inside, setting up a soft bed near the couch. The retriever circled a few times before lying down, her eyes still watching Claire closely. Claire sat beside her, running a gentle hand down her back. "You're not alone anymore." The retriever blinked, then closed her eyes, breathing deeply. But Claire couldn't relax yet, because this wasn't over, not even close. Claire didn't sleep that night. She lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady breathing of the retriever curled up beside her. Every little noise outside made her tense, every creak of the old house setting her nerves on edge. She knew she was being paranoid, but she also knew that paranoia might be the only thing keeping them safe. At some point in the early morning hours, her phone buzzed. She sat up quickly, heart hammering, and reached for it. The message was from Robert. "Robert, no movement outside. I checked the cameras twice. Everything's clear." Claire exhaled, leaning back against the cushions. "For now." She looked down at the retriever, who had lifted her head slightly at the movement. "It's okay, girl. Just checking in. Go back to sleep." The retriever blinked slowly, then rested her head on her paws again. Claire let out a soft sigh and settled back down. But sleep didn't come. By sunrise, she was already making coffee, staring out the window as she waited for the caffeine to kick in. Her mind raced through everything they still didn't know. Why now? Why had Robert's ex-wife come back after all this time? Had she really been watching, waiting for the right moment? Or was this all just an unfortunate coincidence? She needed answers. She texted Lisa. "Can you meet me today? We need to talk." Lisa responded within minutes. "Name the time and place." Claire glanced at the clock. Noon. The diner by the clinic. She spent the rest of the morning taking care of the retriever, keeping her routine as normal as possible. She fed her, took her for a short walk, let her explore the fenced-in backyard. The retriever still hesitated near doors, still looked over her shoulder as if expecting something to happen. But she was calmer than she had been the night before. That was something. At noon, Claire walked into the small diner and spotted Lisa already waiting in a booth near the back. She slid into the seat across from her and didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Did you find anything else?" she asked. Lisa shook her head. "Not much. I've been asking around, but no one seems to know where she is now. It's like she vanished." Claire frowned. "That's not possible. Someone like her doesn't just disappear. She has money, connections, she's somewhere." Lisa hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "I did find one thing, though. I called an old co-worker. She said that before she left town, Robert's ex-wife was obsessed with something, kept talking about unfinished business." Claire's stomach turned. "Unfinished business?" Lisa nodded. She didn't say what it was, but she was fixated on something. Or someone. Claire exhaled. "And now she's back." Lisa nodded again, looking uneasy. "Yeah, and I don't think she's leaving until she gets what she wants." Claire's fingers tapped against the table as she thought. "We need to find her before she finds us." Lisa looked hesitant. "That's not exactly easy. We don't even know where to start." Claire's mind raced. "We start with the last place she lived. Even if she's not there now, someone there might know where she went." Lisa hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but we need to be careful. If she finds out we're looking for her..." Claire met her gaze. "I know." That afternoon, Claire drove out to the last known address Lisa had found. It was an upscale neighborhood, the kind of place where people paid for privacy. The house itself was empty. No cars in the driveway, no sign of life. Claire parked down the street and sat there for a moment, thinking. "What now?" Lisa asked from the passenger seat. Claire scanned the street. "We talked to the neighbors. Someone here has to know something." They started at the house next door, ringing the bell. A woman in her 60s answered, her expression polite but guarded. "Sorry to bother you," Claire said, "but do you know what happened to the woman who used to live next door?" The woman pursed her lips. "She left months ago. Good riddance, if you ask me." Lisa's eyebrows lifted. "Why do you say that?" The woman crossed her arms. "She was always up to something. Strange people coming and going at odd hours, loud arguments. One time she had a screaming match with a man in her driveway. Sounded like he was threatening her." Claire and Lisa exchanged a glance. "Do you remember anything about him?" Claire asked. The woman frowned. "Tall, blonde, dressed well, like he had money, but he was furious." Lisa murmured, "Robert is tall and blonde." Claire's heart pounded. "Was it him?" The woman hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I remember seeing pictures of Robert on the news when the divorce happened. This wasn't him." Claire felt a chill run down her spine. "Then who was he?" The woman shrugged. "No idea. But whatever he wanted, she was scared. She left town not long after that." Claire thanked her and turned back to Lisa as they walked away. "We need to figure out who that man was. If he was threatening her, he might know where she is now." Lisa nodded. "But how do we find him?" Claire's mind worked quickly. If he was someone important, there might be records, security footage from the area, maybe even police reports if someone called them during one of those arguments. Lisa hesitated. "That could take time." Claire glanced toward the empty house. "We don't have much of that." That evening, back at Claire's house, the retriever seemed restless again. She paced near the front door, ears flicking toward every little sound. Claire sat on the floor beside her, rubbing her back gently. "You still feel like something's coming, don't you?" The retriever let out a small whine and laid her head on Claire's lap. Claire exhaled, looking down at her. "We're gonna figure this out. I promise." She didn't know who the blonde man was. She didn't know where Robert's ex-wife had gone. But one thing was clear. The past wasn't done with them yet. Claire barely breathed as she drove back toward town, the retriever curled up in the back seat, eyes darting between Robert and her. The weight of what they had found at the abandoned house hung in the air between them. Vincent Hale. The man who had threatened Robert's ex-wife before she disappeared. The man who had some connection to all of this. Robert was already making calls. We need to find out everything we can on Hale. If he was threatening her, he had a reason. Claire nodded, gripping the wheel tighter. And if he was the one outside your house, then he's not just looking for your ex-wife. He's looking for the retriever. The thought made her stomach churn. The pieces were starting to connect, but the bigger question remained. Why? Why had Robert's ex-wife held on to the retriever's photo? Why had Vincent been involved in her disappearance? And more importantly, what did he want now? When they got back to Robert's house, Claire hesitated before getting out. The retriever whined softly, pressing her nose against her hand as if sensing her hesitation. Robert ran a hand through his hair. You think he'll make a move soon? Claire exhaled. If he knows we're on to him, then yes. He'll want to finish whatever he started. They didn't have to wait long. That night, the security cameras picked up movement outside Robert's house. A shadow lingered just beyond the fence, moving carefully, deliberately. Claire was already awake, her senses on high alert. The retriever lifted her head from the couch, ears perked. Robert checked the footage, his expression unreadable. It's him. Claire's pulse quickened. He's not trying to break in. He's testing us, seeing if we're paying attention. Robert clenched his fists. Then let's make sure he knows we are. Before Claire could stop him, he was heading for the door. She grabbed his wrist. We need to be smart about this. We don't know what he's capable of. Robert hesitated, then nodded. Then we call the police. Let them deal with him. The call was made, but by the time officers arrived, Hale was gone. No sign of him remained, except for the security footage. One of the officers, a tired-looking man in his 50s, frowned at the screen. If he's not making a move yet, he's waiting for something. Claire swallowed. Or someone. The retriever whined again, shifting closer to her. She rubbed her head absent-mindedly, her mind racing. If Hale was watching, then he was waiting for the perfect moment to act. They needed to get ahead of him. The next day, Claire made a decision. We go to him first. Robert raised a brow. You want to track him down? Claire nodded. We have his name. We know he was involved in your ex-wife's affairs. We find him before he finds us. Lisa, who had stayed on the case, came through again. He's got a known associate, she told them over the phone. A guy named Trent Miller used to run security for him. If anyone knows where Hale is, it's him. They found Miller at a run-down bar on the outskirts of town. Claire and Robert entered cautiously, scanning the room until they spotted him in the corner. A man in his late 40s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that immediately landed on them. You're looking for Vincent, he said before they even spoke. Claire didn't flinch. We are. Where is he? Miller smirked. You think I'd just give that information away? Robert stepped forward. If he's after the retriever, we need to know why. This isn't just about some old business deal, is it? Miller sighed, rubbing his temples. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Hale isn't after the dog. He's after what the dog represents. Claire frowned. What do you mean? Miller hesitated, then leaned in. Your ex-wife was into some shady dealings, Robert. She kept records, but not on paper, not on any hard drive. She hid them. Claire's breath caught. And you're saying she hid them with the retriever? Miller nodded. Something embedded in her collar, maybe even microchipped under her skin, but it was something Hale needed. And when your ex-wife disappeared, he thought she took it with her. Robert's face hardened. But she didn't. She left it with the retriever. Miller nodded. And now Hale knows she's alive. Claire felt the weight of it all crash down on her. The retriever wasn't just a survivor. She was holding on to something dangerous, and Hale wouldn't stop until he had it. Where is he now? Robert demanded. Miller hesitated, then sighed. Last I heard, he's staying in an abandoned warehouse near the docks. But be careful. If you go after him, he won't play nice. Claire and Robert didn't waste time. They left the bar, adrenaline coursing through their veins. They knew this was it, the moment that would decide everything. They arrived at the docks under the cover of night. The warehouse was quiet. Almost too quiet. Claire's stomach churned. This feels like a trap. Robert nodded. Stay close. They stepped inside, the retriever staying at Claire's side. The air smelled of dust and rusted metal. Then a voice echoed from the shadows. You've been busy. Vincent Hale stepped into the dim light, a smirk on his face. I knew you'd come looking. Claire's fists clenched. What do you want? Hale's gaze flickered to the retriever. You already know. Robert stepped forward. Whatever you think she has, it's not yours. Hale chuckled. You don't even know what you're protecting, do you? Claire glanced at the retriever. The dog was standing tall, alert, unafraid. And in that moment, Claire knew. It didn't matter what secrets Hale was after. It didn't matter what the retriever had been unknowingly carrying. What mattered was that she was finally safe. Police sirens wailed in the distance. Hale's smirk faltered. Claire exhaled. It's over. For a moment, Hale seemed to consider running. Then, as the sirens grew closer, he turned and disappeared into the darkness. Claire and Robert didn't chase him. They didn't have to. The police would take it from here. Claire knelt beside the retriever, running a hand down her fur. You did it, girl. Robert sighed in relief. She's safe now. Claire looked at him and smiled. Yeah, she is. As the police swarmed the warehouse, Claire knew this chapter had finally closed. The retriever had found her home. And for the first time in a long time, Claire felt at peace. They drove back in silence, the retriever sleeping soundly in the back seat. She was no longer running, no longer waiting for the past to catch up. She was finally free.